The new OnePlus 7T Pro is a minor refresh of the OnePlus 7 Pro with a marginally bigger battery, a slightly faster processor, and slightly faster charging speeds. Now, all of this might not look like much on paper, but is there more to it than meets the eye? It's time to put the OnePlus 7T Pro to the test to see if it's a true T upgrade to the OnePlus 7 Pro. Now, before we go ahead, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and also that bell icon so you're the first to know when we have a new video. The design has remained pretty much the same, and other than the new haze blue color, the only other differentiating factor between the OnePlus 7T Pro and the 7 Pro is the placement of the laser autofocus sensor on the back, which has been moved from within the camera strip to the left of it. Now, the frosted matte texture of the 7T Pro's glass rear feels great in the hand and doesn't attract fingerprints very easily, but it is quite slippery. You still get a 3D Corning Gorilla Glass on the front and back, a pop-up selfie camera, an in-display fingerprint sensor, stereo speakers, and all the same ports and buttons in the same place as the 7 Pro. The display is also the same 6.67-inch Quad HD Plus Fluid AMOLED panel with a 90Hz refresh rate and support for multiple color profiles, including DCI-P3. It's also rated to support HDR10+ encoded videos for displaying a wider spectrum of colors and higher brightness. We found the display to be excellent in most usage conditions. Colors are vibrant and well saturated, the brightness is very good even under sunlight, and viewing angles are great. The OnePlus 7T Pro ships with a pre-applied screen protector, which is a little annoying since lint and fibers tend to stick to it pretty easily. The 90Hz display makes scrolling through the menus feel fluid, and some games such as Rayman Adventures can actually take advantage of it running at the full 90Hz refresh rate. This phone isn't the easiest to handle with one hand, but it's just a matter of getting used to its size. Media files look and sound great on the OnePlus 7T Pro thanks to the HDR display and good stereo speakers. There's even Dolby Atmos here too. The main speaker is louder and produces slightly richer sound than the earpiece, but the two of them don't sound too unbalanced with casual listening. We also like how fast the face recognition and the in-display fingerprint sensor are. The selfie camera module is quick to pop out to authenticate you, and it takes no longer than a standard front camera for all this to work. The USB Type-C port and the SIM tray are on the bottom, and the latter accepts only 2 nano SIM cards. There's no support for a micro SD card, which means you can't expand the internal storage. As before, you don't get a headphone jack either. Now, there's no FM radio, and the 7T Pro still doesn't have any official IP rating for waterproofing. Also, considering this is the company's brand new flagship device, it would have been the perfect time to finally add wireless charging as well, but sadly, OnePlus hasn't done so. Now, when it comes to the software, it's hard to find any company that does a better custom Android skin than OnePlus's OxygenOS. On the 7T Pro, you get OxygenOS 10, which is based on Android 10. The security patch is pretty up to date too, with the September patch pre-installed. There are a few new features such as reading mode, which now gets a new chromatic option, which reduces the saturation level of colors so it's more comfortable to the eye when viewing content. You can manually set which apps use the monochrome and chromatic options, so the display changes accordingly when they are launched. Game Space is redesigned and now offers a more intuitive way to set up customized profiles for each game. You can choose to use gesture-based navigation instead of the 3-button system. This works well except for the back gesture, which can conflict with some pull-out menus in some apps. The OnePlus 7T Pro ships with the Qualcomm Snapdragon 855 Plus SoC and is only available with 8GB of RAM and 256GB of storage, unless you choose the McLaren edition, which gets you a whopping 12GB of RAM. The phone feels extremely fast and snappy. We had absolutely no delays when browsing through the various menus in Android, and the 8GB of RAM comfortably allowed a good number of apps to stay running in the background, making it easy to switch back and forth. PUBG Mobile also ran at the high preset and the gameplay was lag-free. The back of the phone did get a little warm during gameplay, but never uncomfortably hot. Now, the battery capacity of the 7T Pro has increased a tiny bit to 4085 mAh from 4000 mAh on its predecessor. With the display resolution left to the auto switch and the refresh rate at 60Hz, our battery loop test ran for 15 hours and 12 minutes. Now, setting the refresh rate to the default 90Hz, we got a lower figure of 11 hours and 19 minutes of runtime. Real-world battery usage was much better, with a full day of heavy usage at 90Hz, which included testing the cameras, streaming music over Bluetooth, and some benchmarks. We still had about 20% left in the battery at night. The Warp Charge 30T charger managed to charge the battery up to 59% in half an hour and up to 96% in an hour. These are very good charging speeds and will definitely come in handy, especially if you're in a hurry. Now, the OnePlus 7T Pro features the same camera setup as the 7 Pro. This includes a primary 48-megapixel Sony IMX586 sensor with optical stabilization and an f1.6 aperture. Next up is an 8-megapixel telephoto camera, which also has optical stabilization and an f2.4 aperture. And finally, we have a 16-megapixel ultra-wide-angle camera with an f2.2 aperture. In the front, we have a 16-megapixel fixed-focus pop-up camera for selfies. In daylight landscapes, the OnePlus 7T Pro captured good details and colors. HDR works well, exposure is balanced nicely, and there's a good amount of dynamic range even with backlit subjects. Overlay buttons in the viewfinder let you quickly toggle between the 3 different camera sensors. Now, the wide-angle camera is useful for framing more in each shot. Details are slightly poorer compared to the shots taken with the main sensor, but this is only really noticeable if you zoom into the image. The telephoto camera is useful for getting closer to your subject. Details are good and there is optical stabilization, but the focusing speed is a little slower. Now, we came across an autofocus issue once or twice when using the 7T Pro, but not too much. Close-ups in general had very good details and colors with a pleasing shallow depth of field effect. Colors did look a little boosted at times, especially the reds, and some edges of close-up subjects still lacked good definition. We also noticed a bit of color bleeding around the edges of objects in some shots. Now, there's a new super macro mode which we also saw on the OnePlus 7T. This lets you get as close as 2.5 centimeters from your subject. It uses the ultra-wide-angle camera through which we managed to get some really good macros. It's a much better implementation compared to phones with dedicated low-resolution macro cameras, as you do get much crisper shots. In super macro mode, the viewfinder still appears to give you the option to switch between cameras, but what it's actually doing is just digitally zooming in with the ultra-wide camera itself to emulate the perspective of other lenses. The selfie camera captures decent shots under good light. HDR worked well, giving us well-exposed selfies even when shooting against bright light. Skin tones had a slight reddish hue which we didn't quite like, but details overall were pretty decent. Videos are recorded at up to 1080p resolution with the front camera, and there's electronic stabilization too. Now, portrait mode works well when shooting people and objects. You still can't adjust the level of blur before or after you've taken the shot, but thankfully the applied effect looked pleasing most of the time in our experience. Now, the OnePlus 7T Pro did a good job at reproducing accurate colors when shooting in low light. Focusing speed dipped a little, and there were instances where the focus in landscapes and close-ups was a little soft. At times, we also had to manually tap the viewfinder to get the phone to lock focus properly. And the main camera managed to pick up fairly good detail, but shadow regions did have a bit of noise. And the wide-angle camera's narrow aperture doesn't let it capture very bright images, but thankfully you can now use nightscape with this sensor too, making it a lot more useful in low light. Now, keep in mind that while nightscape does brighten the scenes and produce better detail in shadowy areas, textures on objects tend to look a little artificial. We're also happy to see the phone actually using its telephoto camera in most of our low light samples rather than digitally zooming in using the main sensor. Video recording tops out at 4K 60fps. Now, colors continue to be terribly exaggerated at 4K irrespective of the frame rate, which is an issue we also had with the 7 Pro. Reds especially look almost radioactive. Now, colors are a bit more under control at 1080p. We found that the continuous autofocus also worked very well across resolutions. Now, the 7T Pro uses a combination of optical and electronic stabilization whenever possible when shooting at 1080p at 30fps. You can also manually switch between the 3 sensors while recording, but only at this resolution and frame rate. Stabilization is also available at 4K, but you can only use the primary camera for this. The phone also has a super stable stabilization mode which records at 1080p only using the wide-angle camera. With this, the frame is cropped heavily to get rid of the fisheye effect, but in return you get gimbal level stabilization. Now, low light video quality still needs a lot of work. Even at 1080p, the quality is below average as there's a lot of visible grain even in relatively well-lit scenes, and the stabilization causes quite a bit of jitter and distortion when you're moving about. We would have liked to have seen even more meaningful upgrades like the OnePlus 7T received, but this isn't the case with the OnePlus 7T Pro. There isn't much differentiation between the two product tiers anymore, apart from the higher resolution curved display and the pop-up camera on the more expensive model. Now, this is still one of the best looking phones at around 54,000 rupees. However, it's still a pretty steep premium to pay over the OnePlus 7T, which shares many of its same features but at a much lower price. Now, some might argue that the design and the high-resolution display alone are worth the high premium, and if you're somebody who falls in that camp, then you won't be disappointed. So thanks for watching our review of the OnePlus 7T Pro, and for all things tech, log on to gadgets360.com.